You really left a six-figure career for 34 acres and a tractor? Richard asked, standing beside his spotless black SUV as if the gravel under his shoes had personally offended him. I looked past him toward the old red barn, the apple trees beyond it, and the fields glowing under the late September sun. 34 acres and 2 tractors, I said. I would hate for you to underestimate me. My brother laughed. Caroline did too, although she tried to hide it behind her coffee cup. I had heard some version of the joke for 8 years, ever since I left Columbus and bought the farm outside a small Ohio town where the nearest grocery store was 11 miles away. Before that, I managed commercial properties, wore pressed shirts 5 days a week, and spent enough time in conference rooms to forget what daylight looked like. The salary was good. The benefits were better. According to my family, walking away from that life at 44 was either a midlife crisis or evidence that I had temporarily lost my judgment. I never bothered correcting them. The farmhouse was modest, about 1,800 square feet, with white siding I had repainted twice and a porch that still leaned slightly toward the east. The barn had been standing since the 1950s. My Ford pickup was 11 years old. My work boots usually had mud on them, and most mornings began before sunrise. None of that impressed Richard. He was 57, an executive in Columbus, and had recently bought the SUV he was now carefully protecting from my driveway. Caroline, our younger sister, worked in real estate and had developed the habit of estimating the resale value of every building she entered. She had been inside my house for less than 20 minutes before suggesting that replacing the kitchen cabinets might increase the property value. I am not selling it, I told her. Everybody says that until somebody gives them the right number, she replied. Melissa, Richard's wife, stepped onto the porch and looked toward the barn. It is peaceful, she said, in the tone people use when they cannot think of anything more flattering. That is one word for it, Richard said. His son Ethan was the only one who seemed genuinely interested. At 29, he had spent most of his life in the city, and within an hour he had asked me more questions about the orchard than Richard had asked about the farm in 8 years. How many apple trees? Ethan asked as we walked toward the barn. A little over 60. You sell everything locally? Most of it. Restaurants, a farmer's market, and a small grocery cooperative. Richard followed us. And that actually pays. The restaurants generally prefer that I charge them. Ethan smiled. Richard shook his head. You know what I mean. I did. What he meant was whether this life produced enough money to justify abandoning the version of success he understood. I opened the barn and checked a crate of produce scheduled for pickup the next morning. I pay my bills. That is not the same as building something. I looked at him. Is that what you think I am doing? Daniel, look around. So I did. Beyond the barn, my vegetable field stretched toward the old fence line. Past that fence were hundreds of acres of corn, pasture, woodland, and rolling ground that disappeared toward a distant ridge. The neighboring property had belonged to Walter Hayes for most of his adult life. Richard followed my eyes. Now that is land, he said. I almost smiled. Yes, it is. Caroline joined us, suddenly more interested than she had been in my orchard. How much does Hayes own? Around 620 acres. She gave a low whistle. All connected? Mostly. Road frontage? Quite a bit. Her professional instincts had awakened. That property could be worth serious money. Depends what you want it for. Richard stepped closer to the fence. Apparently somebody wants it badly. I turned toward him. What do you mean? Richard and Caroline exchanged a look. It was the first moment that afternoon when I realized their visit was not simply a family gathering. Caroline heard about a development group looking at this corridor, Richard said. Caroline lowered her voice, although there was nobody nearby to overhear us. They have been assembling parcels closer to the interstate. Residential, retail, maybe some light commercial use. Nothing is final. And? I asked. And the Hayes property could change everything. 620 acres in one block is rare. I leaned against the barn door. Walter never liked developers. Caroline studied me. You still talk to him? I talked to him plenty. She seemed to miss the tense. Richard did not. Talked, he asked. Before I could answer, a white pickup came down the gravel access road running along the neighboring property. The driver slowed when he saw me, rolled down his window, and raised a hand. Daniel, I finished the south fence. I left the invoice in your workshop. Thanks, Mike. I will look at it tonight. He drove away. Richard stared after the truck. Why is somebody repairing Walter's fence leaving the invoice with you? Because I need to approve it. Caroline's expression changed slightly. Why would you approve work on someone else's property? I closed the barn door. It is complicated. Richard laughed again. Everything about farming seems complicated when you could just own a condo. I let that one go. We walked back toward the house, but Caroline kept glancing toward the neighboring fields. Over dinner, the conversation returned to the development project. Richard talked about land values, highway access, and what a large builder might pay. Caroline estimated that the right deal could run into several $1 million. I listened while cutting my steak. Finally Richard leaned back and said, if Walter's family has any sense, they will sell before the market changes. I set down my fork. What family? Richard looked at Caroline. Caroline looked at me. His heirs, she said. Walter did not have children. Then whoever inherited it. I took a sip of water. Have either of you actually checked the current deed? Richard smiled as though I had asked whether Caroline knew how to read a street sign. Daniel, Caroline sells real estate for a living. That was not what I asked. The table became quiet. Caroline narrowed her eyes. What exactly are you trying to tell us? I looked through the dining room window toward the fields beyond my 34 acres. 3 years earlier, that question would have required a very different answer. Now it required only a trip to the county recorder's office. Nothing, I said. I am suggesting that before you start spending somebody else's millions, you might want to find out whose name is actually attached to the land. Caroline did not wait until morning to start checking. By the time I finished loading the dishwasher, she was sitting at my kitchen table with her laptop open, moving between county property maps and real estate databases while Richard stood behind her drinking coffee. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching both of them with the kind of interest people usually reserve for a mystery they did not expect to find at a family dinner. Walter Hayes still appears on several records, Caroline said. Several? I asked. Older parcel records. Agricultural filings. Some tax history. Older is doing a lot of work in that sentence. She ignored me. The county system is not showing everything clearly from here. Then maybe you should stop trying to investigate my neighbor during dessert. Richard smiled. You are the one who made it sound mysterious. I suggested you verify something before making assumptions. Same thing. Not remotely. Melissa carried 2 coffee mugs into the living room and wisely stayed out of it. Caroline continued searching. I dried a plate and placed it in the cabinet. When did you last talk to Walter? She asked. Why? Because you said talked instead of talk. Ethan looked at me. He had noticed too. Walter died last February, I said. The room went quiet. Richard lowered his coffee. I did not know that. Most people outside this area did not. I am sorry, Ethan said. Thanks. Walter had been 78 when he died. For almost 7 years, I had seen him more often than I saw most of my relatives. Calling him a neighbor did not quite cover it, but I was not interested in explaining that yet. Caroline closed one browser window and opened another. If he had no children, somebody inherited the property. Usually how estates work. Daniel. Caroline. Richard pulled out a chair. Did Walter leave the land to some distant relative? You are very interested in Walter all of a sudden. 620 acres will do that, he said. That sentence told me almost everything I needed to know. Exactly. Ethan glanced toward the dark window above the sink. Beyond it, the neighboring fields were barely visible beneath the moonlight. Did he ever sell any of it? Not while he was alive. Caroline turned toward me. Then who is paying the property taxes now? They are being paid. By whom? The appropriate party. Richard laughed. You have become unbelievably irritating since moving to the country. Fresh air. Caroline finally shut the laptop. Fine. I will check Monday. Please do. Her expression suggested she thought I was bluffing. That did not bother me. The next morning, I was outside shortly after 6:30. Richard and Melissa planned to leave after breakfast, but Ethan came down wearing jeans and asked if he could help. You own boots? I asked. I own shoes that I am willing to sacrifice. Close enough. We loaded several crates of apples into my pickup and drove toward the orchard. The sun was just beginning to rise over the eastern ridge, turning the fields gold. When we reached the old fence dividing my original 34 acres from the Hayes property, I stopped the truck and climbed out. Ethan followed. That is Walter's land, he asked. That was always what people called it. He looked across the fields. From where we stood, the property seemed almost endless. Cornfields stretched toward a line of trees nearly half a mile away, and beyond that were pasture and woodland. 620 acres does not sound this big when somebody says it. Most numbers do not. A green utility vehicle approached from the other side of the field. Sam Porter, who leased roughly 80 acres for corn, pulled up beside us. Morning, Daniel. Morning. He handed me a folder. Updated lease paperwork. I signed everything you requested. Ethan looked from the folder to me. Thanks, Sam. I will review it tonight. Also, the drainage contractor wants approval before he starts the north section. Tell him Tuesday is fine, but I want the estimate first. Will do. Sam drove away. Ethan remained silent until the utility vehicle disappeared. Why? Is a farmer leasing Walter's land from you? You ask better questions than your father. That is not an answer. No. It is a compliment. We continued toward the orchard. Ethan did not push, which I appreciated. About an hour later, Richard joined us carrying a travel mug and looking entirely too clean for someone standing near livestock. He saw the folder on the passenger seat. What is that? Paperwork. For what? A farm lease. Your farm? Not exactly. He stared at me. Daniel, what is going on? Before I could answer, my phone rang. The caller identification showed Bennett Development Group. I stepped several feet away and answered. A man named Paul Bennett introduced himself, although we had spoken twice before. He represented the development group Caroline had mentioned. Mr. Mercer, I wanted to confirm Thursday's meeting, he said. 10 in the morning. That works. Our team will have the revised proposal ready. We would like to discuss the Hayes acreage as a complete package if possible. I looked across the fields. You can present whatever proposal you want. Understood. Will the other decision-makers be attending? There are no other decision-makers. Richard was close enough to hear that sentence. His expression changed. We will see you Thursday, Bennett said. I ended the call. Richard immediately pointed toward my phone. Was that the developer? Yes. Why are they calling you? Because we have a meeting. About your 34 acres. Among other things. Richard looked toward the neighboring fields and then back at me. Are you working as Walter's estate manager or something? Not exactly. Then what exactly? I picked up one of the apple crates. You were leaving after breakfast. I can leave later. I thought the farm bored you. It is becoming more interesting. Ethan smiled. I carried the crate toward the truck. Richard followed me. Does Caroline know about this meeting? No. Should she? That depends. On what? I secured the crate and closed the tailgate. On whether she wants to hear an offer for land she spent yesterday discussing as though the owner was not sitting at the same dinner table. Richard stared at me long enough that Ethan finally cleared his throat and asked whether we were still loading apples. That broke the moment. Richard looked toward the house, then back at the neighboring fields. You are saying you own that land? I said the owner was sitting at dinner. That sounds exactly like you are saying you own it. Ownership can be more complicated than a name on a mailbox. He gave me an irritated look. You know what I mean. And you know what I mean. I lifted another crate into the truck while Richard remained beside the fence. He had spent the previous evening treating the Hayes property like an opportunity waiting for someone intelligent enough to recognize it. Now he was trying to understand why his younger brother, the man with the old pickup and muddy boots, had been taking calls about it. Caroline came outside 20 minutes later with her laptop under one arm. Apparently Richard had already called her from the orchard. I found something, she said before reaching us. Good morning to you too. The online records are incomplete, but there was a transfer filing 3 years ago involving something called the Hayes Agricultural Land Trust. I nodded. There was. And your name appears on one of the index documents. Richard looked at her. What does that mean? I do not know yet. Caroline turned toward me. Trustee? Yes. Her expression sharpened. You are the trustee of Walter's land. One of the roles I hold. One of the roles? That is what I said. Caroline opened the laptop on the tailgate, but the weak signal made the county website load slowly. Richard leaned over her shoulder. Ethan stayed beside me. You are enjoying this, he said quietly. A little. I knew it. I am only human. Caroline finally closed the computer in frustration. I need the actual recorded documents. County Recorder's office opens Monday at 8:30. I know when it opens. Then we have solved one problem. She folded her arms. Why did Walter put you in charge? That question was different from the others. It was not about acreage or development value. For the first time, she was asking about Walter. I looked across the fence. Toward the northern pasture. Because we worked together for years. Doing what? Keeping the farm operating. Walter had been 69 when I bought my 34 acres. Our first conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. He came over because one of my fence posts leaned onto his property, and he wanted to know whether I planned to fix it before winter. I told him I would handle it that afternoon. When he returned the next morning and found the entire damaged section repaired, he nodded once and said, "Good." That was Walter's version of friendship for the first 6 months. Eventually he started asking for help with equipment, paperwork, and lease agreements. My years managing commercial property turned out to be useful in ways my family never imagined. Walter understood soil, livestock, weather, and machinery better than anyone I knew, but he hated contracts. I understood contracts. By the second year, we were reviewing every agricultural lease together at his kitchen table. None of that seemed important enough to explain to Richard when he called my life a hobby. So you worked for him? Richard asked. Sometimes. He paid you? Sometimes. Caroline studied me. And sometimes he did not. Walter was my neighbor. That does not explain a trust involving 620 acres. Before I answered, another truck came through the gate from the Hayes side. This one belonged to a survey company. A woman named Lisa Grant stepped out carrying a rolled map and a clipboard. Daniel, I need your signature on the boundary authorization before we mark the western section. I took the clipboard. Richard actually laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course you do. Lisa glanced at him, confused. Family, I explained. Understood, she said in a tone suggesting that explained everything. I reviewed the authorization, signed it, and asked her to avoid the drainage line near the north pasture until Sam finished harvesting. No problem. We will start along the county road. After she drove away, Caroline looked at my signature on the copy she had left behind. You are authorizing a survey on the Hayes property. Yes. You approve leases. Yes. You approve repairs. Yes. And a developer is presenting an offer directly to you. Thursday morning. Richard rubbed his forehead. Yesterday you let us sit at your table talking about this land for an hour. You were doing most of the talking. You could have said something. I asked whether you checked the deed. You knew we had not. That was fairly obvious. Ethan laughed. Caroline did not. She walked toward the fence and stared across the acreage. How much control do you actually have? She asked. Enough that nobody is developing anything without my approval. That finally silenced her. A breeze moved through the corn, creating long waves across the field. Richard looked toward the distant ridge as if the landscape had physically changed since yesterday. It had not. The only thing changing was his understanding of it. How much is all this worth? He asked. I expected that question from him eventually. Walter hated that question. I am not asking Walter. No. You are asking me. So. I picked up the last apple crate. I know approximately what developers think it is worth. And? You will hear their number Thursday. Richard looked at Caroline. We are going to that meeting. I closed the tailgate. I did not invite you. Daniel. Richard. Caroline stepped between us before the conversation became childish. If the proposal affects family interests, maybe we should understand it. Whose family interests? She hesitated. That hesitation mattered. Yours, she finally said. Exactly. I started toward the driver's door, but Ethan remained by the fence. Uncle Daniel, he called. I turned. If Walter trusted you with this much land, why did you keep living on 34 acres like nothing changed? Richard and Caroline both looked at me. Of all the questions they had asked, Ethan had found the one closest to the truth. Because nothing important did change, I said. The farmhouse was still mine. The work still needed doing. Walter still expected the gates closed properly. Ethan looked across the field again. And after he died. I rested my hand on the truck door. After Walter died, the gate still needed closing. Caroline was quiet for several seconds. Then she asked the question I knew would eventually lead her to the rest of the story. Daniel, what exactly did Walter put in that trust? 620 acres, the farmhouse, the equipment buildings, the timber ground, the agricultural leases, and the water rights attached to the property, I said. Caroline stared at me. All of it? All of it that Walter still controlled when the trust was created. Richard stepped closer. And you are the trustee? Yes. So you manage it for whoever inherited it. That is part of what I do. Caroline immediately caught the wording. Part of it again. I picked up the folder Sam had given me and headed toward the workshop. You are both becoming excellent listeners. They followed me. Ethan came too, although unlike his father and aunt, he seemed interested in understanding rather than calculating. Inside the workshop, I placed the lease documents beside a stack of invoices. Richard looked around at the workbench, tractor manuals, seed catalogs, and filing cabinet in the corner. Nothing about the room looked like the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar property operation, which seemed to bother him. Where are the trust documents? Caroline asked. Some are with the attorney. Copies are in the cabinet. She looked at the cabinet. Can I see them? No. Why not? Because you are my sister, not my attorney. Richard exhaled impatiently. Daniel, nobody is trying to steal anything. I did not say you were. Then why are you being so secretive? I turned toward him. I am not secretive. You simply never asked about any of this until you heard the word development. He started to answer, then stopped. Ethan looked down, hiding a smile. Caroline leaned against the workbench. Fair enough. But if Bennett Development is making an offer Thursday, they clearly believe you have authority to negotiate. Correct. How large an offer? I do not know their revised number. Their revised number? Richard repeated. There was already an offer. 2 preliminary ones. And you never mentioned them. During which conversation? The one where you told me my tractor was evidence of poor financial planning. Or the Christmas dinner where you suggested I sell the farm and move into a condo. Richard looked away. Caroline remained focused. What were the preliminary offers? Not enough. Not enough meaning what? Meaning Walter would have thrown them in the trash. That afternoon, Richard postponed his drive home. Caroline cancelled whatever plans she had in Columbus. By Sunday evening, both of them had decided they wanted to attend Thursday's meeting. I told them I would consider it. Monday morning, Caroline drove to the county recorder's office before I finished feeding the cattle. She returned shortly after 10 carrying printed documents in a manila folder. I was repairing a gate near the south pasture when her car came down the gravel drive. She got out before the engine had fully settled. You knew I would find this. That was the general purpose of telling you to check the records. She opened the folder. The Hayes Agricultural Land Trust was recorded 3 years ago. Correct. Walter transferred the real property into the trust. Correct. You are listed as successor trustee. Correct. She flipped another page. And there is an agricultural conservation restriction covering most of the acreage. Now you understand why your subdivision calculations were premature. Caroline looked across the field. This limits development significantly. That was intentional. Walter did this. Walter and I worked on it together. Why would you agree to restrict land worth millions? Because Walter did not spend 50 years keeping it together so someone could cover all of it with pavement the moment he was gone. She studied me. But there are exceptions. Certain sections along the county road can be developed under specific conditions. Her real estate instincts returned immediately. How many acres? About 74, depending on the proposal. She looked back at the records. 74 acres with that frontage could still be extremely valuable. Yes. And the remaining agricultural land generates income. Yes. Leases, timber management, possibly conservation payments. Among other things. She closed the folder. Daniel, this is not a hobby. I smiled. You traveled all the way to the county office to discover that. She did not smile back. I am serious. You have been managing an asset worth several $1 million while letting everyone think you were barely making a living selling apples. I never told anyone I was barely making a living. You never corrected us. There is a difference. Caroline became quiet. The wind moved through the pasture behind us. Finally she asked, who benefits from the trust? There it was. The question the public records could not fully answer. That information is not recorded with the deed. I know. Then why ask? Because Walter had no children. His wife died years ago. I cannot find any close relatives connected to the property. You have been busy. I am trying to understand why you have this much authority. I set the wrench on the fence post. Walter trusted me. Trustees do not necessarily own what they manage. Correct. So who does? Before I could answer, Richard's SUV appeared at the end of the driveway. He had apparently decided Monday morning in the country was more important than whatever waited at his office. He parked beside Caroline's car and walked toward us. "Tell me she found something." Caroline held up the folder. "A lot." Richard looked at me. "So it is true." "Depends what she told you." "You control the property." "Operationally, yes. But you do not own it." Caroline glanced at me before answering for him. "That part is not clear." Richard seemed relieved, which I found interesting. "So Walter left it to somebody else and made Daniel the manager?" "Possibly," Caroline said. "Possibly?" Richard looked between us. "How can nobody know who owns 620 acres? I picked up my wrench. "Somebody knows." Richard frowned. "Who?" "The attorney who drafted the trust." "Me." "And until February, Walter." Richard stepped closer. "Then tell us." "Thursday." "Why Thursday?" "Because if you are both determined to sit in that meeting, I would rather let the documents answer your questions once." Caroline watched me carefully. "You are actually letting us come?" "Yes." Richard nodded toward the neighboring land. "Good. Because if Bennett development is serious, you need people there who understand business." I looked at my brother, then at Caroline. She closed her eyes briefly, as if even she knew he had chosen the worst possible sentence. I picked up the wrench and returned to the gate. "Thursday at 10, I said. "Try not to be late." Richard started back toward his SUV. Caroline stayed behind. "Daniel." I looked at her. "What?" She lowered her voice. There was another name referenced in the trust index. Mercer Agricultural Holdings. I said nothing. "I searched the state business records," she continued. "You formed that company 3 years ago, the same month Walter created the trust." Richard was too far away to hear us. Caroline held my gaze. "Whatever happens Thursday, this is bigger than being Walter's farm manager, is it not?" I tightened the final bolt on the gate and tested the hinge. "Yes," I said. "It is." Caroline did not mention Mercer Agricultural Holdings to Richard that afternoon, and I did not ask her to keep it quiet. She simply understood that she had reached the point where guessing would create more confusion than answers. By Tuesday, Richard had returned to Columbus for work, but he called me twice before lunch. The first call was to confirm Thursday's meeting. The second was to ask whether Bennett Development had sent me an agenda. "You have become remarkably interested in my little farm," I said. "This is not about your farm anymore." "That is interesting." "What is?" 2 days ago, you thought everything around here was part of the same bad decision." He ignored that. "Caroline says there are 74 acres that could potentially be developed. Under certain conditions. Do you understand what 74 acres near that corridor could be worth?" "Yes." "Then why do you sound like we are discussing a used lawn mower?" "Because Thursday is a meeting, not an auction." After we hung up, I spent the afternoon doing exactly what I would have done if no developer existed. I repaired an irrigation line, checked the orchard, reviewed Sam's lease, and delivered produce to a restaurant 23 miles away. That evening, Ethan called. Unlike his father, he did not ask about money. "Can I ask you something about Walter?" he said. "Sure." "Dad makes it sound like you somehow ended up managing the property after Walter died. But Aunt Caroline said the trust was created 3 years ago." "That is correct." "So Walter chose you while he was still alive?" "Yes." "Why?" I looked through my kitchen window toward Walter's old farmhouse in the distance. "That answer takes longer than a phone call." "Then maybe sometime you can tell me." "I will." Wednesday passed quietly. Thursday did not. At 9:45 in the morning, Richard's SUV arrived first. Caroline pulled in behind him 5 minutes later. Both were dressed as though we were meeting in a downtown law office instead of my converted workshop. Richard wore a blazer. Caroline carried a leather portfolio. I wore a clean denim shirt and work boots. Richard looked at my boots. You are wearing those? They have successfully attended meetings before. This could be an 8-figure conversation. Then the boots will have an exciting morning. Caroline almost smiled. At 10 exactly, 2 vehicles from Bennett Development came down the driveway. Paul Bennett stepped out of the first one with his project director, Laura Chen. Their land use attorney arrived in the second vehicle along with a planning consultant. I had met Paul before. Richard clearly had not expected that. Paul walked directly toward me and shook my hand. Daniel, good to see you again. You too, Paul. He nodded toward Richard and Caroline. Your advisors? Richard opened his mouth, but I answered first. My brother and sister. They asked to listen. Of course. We went inside the workshop, where I had cleared the large table. Paul opened a presentation binder and spread out an aerial map. The Hayes property dominated the page. My original 34 acres appeared beside it like a postage stamp. Richard stared at the map. Paul began by explaining that Bennett Development had revised its proposal after reviewing the conservation restrictions. They were no longer seeking the entire property. Instead, they wanted an option on approximately 68 acres along the county road, with additional access rights across another narrow section. Their proposed project included residential units, neighborhood retail space, and infrastructure improvements. Caroline asked several technical questions. They were good questions. Paul answered them carefully. Then he reached the financial section. Our revised acquisition offer for the developable acreage is $9.2 million, subject to final survey, zoning approvals, and due diligence. Richard stopped moving. Caroline remained composed, but I saw her grip tighten around her pen. Paul continued. We would also cover specified road improvements and certain utility extension costs. Richard looked at me as if waiting for a reaction. I wrote the number in my notebook. And the access easement? I asked. Laura answered. Separate compensation. We have included preliminary terms in Appendix C. I want agricultural traffic protected during construction. We anticipated that. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Richard barely spoke. Finally, Paul turned toward me. Mr. Mercer, assuming the technical issues can be resolved, do you believe the trust would consider these terms? Richard looked sharply at the word trust. I will review them, I said. But the conservation provisions remain non-negotiable. Understood. And there will be no development beyond the designated acreage. Understood. Richard finally leaned forward. I have a question. Paul nodded. Certainly. Richard pointed toward the aerial map. Who has final authority to accept or reject this offer? Paul glanced at me, apparently unsure why the question needed asking. Mr. Mercer does. Richard looked at Caroline. As trustee? Caroline asked. Paul hesitated. Daniel can explain the structure better than I can. I closed my notebook. The trust holds the restricted agricultural property. Mercer Agricultural Holdings controls the designated development parcels and several related rights. Richard stared at me. Controls how? It is the managing entity. Who owns Mercer Agricultural Holdings? Nobody at the table spoke. Paul looked down at his documents. Caroline already knew what answer was coming. I do, I said. Richard blinked. All of it? Yes. So the 68 acres they are offering $9.2 million for belong to your company. The company holds the controlling interest in those parcels. His eyes moved from me to the map. And the rest? I am successor trustee and primary beneficiary under Walter's estate plan, subject to the agricultural restrictions he required. Richard leaned back slowly. The room became so quiet that I could hear the old wall clock above the filing cabinet. Caroline looked at the map again. So when the public records showed Daniel as trustee, that was only part of the structure. Exactly, I said. Richard seemed to be doing arithmetic in his head. How much land do you effectively control? The original 34 acres are mine personally. The Hayes structure covers approximately 620 more. He stared through the workshop window toward the fields. That is over 650 acres. Approximately. Paul waited politely, but the meeting had stopped being about his proposal. Richard looked back at me. Walter left you all of this? Not exactly. Caroline turned toward me. What does that mean? I looked at the aerial map, then at the old photograph of Walter pinned beside my filing cabinet. He was standing next to a tractor, wearing the same faded cap he had worn almost every day I knew him. It means the story did not start with Walter giving me land, I said. It started 3 years earlier, when Walter was about to lose part of it. Paul Bennett and his team left shortly before noon, but Richard and Caroline stayed in the workshop. For several minutes, neither of them said anything. The aerial map remained spread across the table, with the proposed 68-acre development area outlined near the county road and the rest of the Hayes property stretching across the page. Richard finally pointed toward Walter's photograph. What happened 3 years before the trust? He asked. I sat down. Walter had debt. Caroline looked surprised. On land that had been in his family for generations. Land does not pay every bill just because it has been in the same family a long time. Walter had owned the property outright for years, but farming had never produced the kind of cash people imagined when they heard 620 acres. His wife, Margaret, had been sick before she died, and the years surrounding her illness had been expensive. Walter also made several equipment purchases at exactly the wrong time. Then 2 difficult growing seasons arrived almost back to back. By the time I understood how serious things were, he had borrowed against part of the property and was struggling with payments. How much? Richard asked. Enough that selling became a real possibility. Caroline leaned forward. Was Bennett Development involved then? No. Different buyers. Mostly investors looking for discounted acreage. I remembered sitting at Walter's kitchen table one January evening while snow covered the fields outside. He had 3 offers in front of him. Every one of them required selling a large section of the farm. Walter was 75 by then. He could have taken the money, paid everything off, and lived comfortably. Why did he refuse? Ethan asked from the workshop doorway. I had not heard him arrive. He stepped inside and took the empty chair beside Caroline. Because Walter did not think of land the way investors did, I said. He believed owning it meant being responsible for what happened to it after you were gone. Richard looked at the map. That sounds admirable until the bank wants its money. Walter knew that. That was when my old career became useful. I reviewed every loan, lease, tax record, equipment note, and insurance document he had. There was value on the farm that Walter was not using efficiently. Some acreage could generate better lease income. Timber management could be improved. Several expenses could be restructured. But even after all of that, he needed capital. So you invested? Caroline asked. Eventually. Richard stared at me. How much? A substantial part of what I had saved before leaving Columbus. You put your retirement savings into Walter's farm. Not all of it. How much, Daniel? Enough. He shook his head. That is insane. It worked. That does not make it sane. Caroline ignored him. What did you receive in return? At first. Secured interests in designated parcels and an operating stake. Her eyes moved immediately toward the development section on the map. The road frontage. Some of it. That became Mercer Agricultural Holdings. Eventually. I explained that Walter refused to accept charity. I had never offered charity. We built a structure that protected both of us. My investment helped refinance the immediate obligations. Walter contributed certain property interests. I contributed capital and management. Over time, the agricultural operation became stronger. The leases improved. Expenses stabilized. The debt declined. 2 years later, Walter approached me about what would happen after he died. Did you ask him for the land? Ethan asked. Never. Not even once. Not even indirectly. I remembered Walter sitting on my porch with 2 cups of coffee. He had been quieter than usual. Finally he said, "Everybody who comes around lately wants to know what the place is worth." I told him that was what people asked when they saw acreage near expanding development. Walter looked toward the fields and said something I never forgot. "You are the only one who never asked." Caroline lowered her eyes. Richard said nothing. Walter chose the trust structure because he wanted most of the land protected, I continued. He wanted farming to continue. He wanted the woodland managed responsibly. He wanted the property kept together as much as possible. And he made you beneficiary, Caroline said. Primary beneficiary, subject to the restrictions and obligations. Because you helped save the farm. Richard asked. That was part of it. What was the other part? I looked at Walter's photograph. He trusted me not to destroy what we saved. Richard leaned back. The answer clearly frustrated him because it could not be reduced to a purchase price. So he basically gave you millions of dollars. No. Caroline looked at him. Richard. What? That is what happened. No, I said. Walter gave me responsibility for something worth millions of dollars. Those are not the same thing. Ethan nodded slowly. Caroline understood immediately. Richard took longer. But you could sell the developable acreage, he said. Some of it, yes. For $9.2 million. That is the offer. And you are considering turning it down. I am considering whether the proposal fits what Walter and I agreed the land could become. Richard stood and walked toward the workshop window. You know what bothers me. Several things today, apparently. He ignored the joke. You had all of this going on while we thought you were struggling. I was never struggling. You lived like you were. I looked around my workshop. What exactly does struggling look like to you? He gestured toward the barn outside, my pickup, my work clothes. This. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Caroline looked at her brother. Richard, stop. But I was not offended anymore. That was the strange part. 8 years earlier, his judgment might have bothered me. Now it only explained why he had never understood my life. I own my house, I said. I have no personal debt. The farm pays for itself. I like my work. I know my neighbors. I wake up most mornings wanting to be exactly where I am. Richard turned toward me. You could have told us you were successful. You never asked what I was building. You only asked why it looked so small. That ended the argument. Caroline closed her portfolio. Ethan looked through the window toward the fields. Richard remained standing beside the map, silent for nearly a minute. Then he pointed to the development outline. What are you going to do about the offer? I folded the aerial map carefully. I am going to do what Walter expected me to do. Which is? I looked toward the 620 acres beyond my fence. Decide whether $9.2 million is worth changing something we spent years protecting. The $9.2 million offer sat on my kitchen table for 3 days, and every morning I walked past it to make coffee before sunrise. Richard called twice on Friday. Caroline called once. Neither asked whether I had accepted. They had finally learned enough to ask what I thought of the proposal instead. The money is impressive, Caroline said. But the project is too large. Bennett already reduced it. Not enough. The problem. was not simply the 68 acres. Their plan required new roads, expanded utility corridors, stormwater infrastructure, and access that would push construction activity farther into the agricultural property than the purchase map suggested. Walter had taught me to look beyond property lines. A decision made on one field could change drainage, traffic, soil, and farming conditions several hundred yards away. Saturday morning, I drove to Walter's old farmhouse. I still kept it maintained, although nobody lived there permanently. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet because I had never found a reason to move it. In the small office beside the kitchen, I opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed the folder we had prepared when the trust was established. On top was a handwritten page Walter had given me after signing the final documents. It was not legally binding. It did not need to be. He had written 3 things he wanted me to remember. Keep the good ground working. Do not let quick money make permanent decisions. Leave the place stronger than you found it. I had read those words many times. That morning they felt less like instructions and more like a question. Could I accept part of Bennett's proposal without betraying the reason Walter trusted me? By Sunday evening, I had my answer. Monday morning, I called Paul. I am not accepting the current proposal. There was a pause. Is this about price? No. Then what needs to change? The footprint. We met again Wednesday. This time I went alone. I proposed reducing the development area from 68 acres to 41. I eliminated the access route that crossed productive farmland and required the primary entrance to remain along the county road. I also asked Bennett to fund a permanent buffer between the project and the agricultural acreage, along with drainage improvements that would protect the lower fields. Paul studied the revised map. You understand reducing the acreage reduces the purchase price. I assumed you were not planning to pay $9.2 million for 41 acres. Some sellers would try. Then you should negotiate with them. He smiled. What are you asking? A fair market price for the 41 acres, plus infrastructure commitments written into the agreement. And if we cannot agree, then nothing changes. That was the advantage Walter had spent decades creating. I did not need the deal. The farm produced income. The debt was gone. Taxes were manageable. There was no clock forcing me to sell. By Friday, Bennett returned with a revised proposal of $6.4 million for the smaller parcel, plus road and drainage commitments that would cost them substantially more. I sent everything to the trust attorney and land use counsel. Then I called Caroline. I turned down the $9.2 million offer. Silence. Richard is going to fall out of his chair. That seems inconvenient. What did you negotiate instead? I told her. Another silence followed. You gave up almost $3 million. I gave up 27 acres of development. That is one way to describe it. It is the accurate way. She surprised me by saying, I think Walter would agree. Richard did not. He drove out Saturday morning specifically to tell me so. We stood beside the orchard while I repaired a section of irrigation tubing. You rejected $9.2 million for 6.4. I rejected one project and negotiated another. That is $2.8 million less. Thank you. I had not discovered subtraction yet. Daniel, be serious. I stood and wiped my hands on a rag. I am serious. That is why I did it. He pointed toward the neighboring fields. You could take the money and preserve the rest. The original plan affected the rest. According to you. According to the engineers too. That stopped him briefly. I explained the drainage concerns, traffic route, utility corridor, and construction footprint. Richard listened, although reluctantly. So you are willing to sell some land? Walter never opposed every change. Neither do I. Then where is the line? Where development stops supporting the farm and starts consuming it? Richard looked across the orchard. I would have taken the 9.2. I know. Does that bother you? No. Why not? Because it was never your decision. He looked at me, and for once there was no argument in his face. That is probably the part one am still getting used to. We walked toward the farmhouse. Near the fence, Sam was checking the cornfield before harvest. Richard watched him for a moment. How many people depend on this property? Depends what you mean by depend. Income. I thought about it. Sam leased 80 acres. Another family leased pasture. 2 neighboring farms used equipment storage. The orchard employed seasonal workers. Several local businesses purchased produce directly. Contractors handled fencing, drainage, equipment repairs, and forestry work. More than you would guess. And Walter knew that. Better than anyone. Richard nodded slowly. We reached the porch, and he sat on the top step. I spent years thinking you came out here because you could not keep up with the rest of us. I leaned against the railing. I know. Why did you never defend yourself? Because I did not need you to understand my life before I could enjoy it. He looked down at his shoes. That sounds worse when you say it out loud. Most assumptions do. He gave a small laugh. Then he looked toward the fields again. For what it is worth, I was wrong. Richard was not a man who apologized easily, and I knew better than to make the moment harder than it needed to be. For what it is worth, you were very confident about it. He laughed again. A few minutes later, Caroline's car appeared at the end of the gravel drive. When she reached the porch, she was carrying the original county document she had copied earlier that week. I found something else, she said. What? She placed the folder beside me. Walter amended the trust 6 months before he died. I already knew that. Richard did not. What did he change? He asked. Caroline looked at me. Apparently, he decided Daniel had not been given enough responsibility. Caroline opened the folder on the porch table and slid a copy of the amendment toward Richard. The original trust gave Daniel management authority and named him primary beneficiary after Walter's death, she said. The amendment expanded that authority. Richard read the first page, then the second. Expanded it how? Walter transferred the remaining voting interest in Mercer Agricultural Holdings to Daniel. Richard looked up. Remaining interest. I nodded. Walter originally retained 35%. And you had 65%. Through my investment and the restructuring, yes. Caroline tapped another section. 6 months before Walter died, he transferred his remaining interest to Daniel. He also gave Daniel broader discretion over the agricultural leases, conservation programs, and any permitted sale of the development parcels. Richard stared at the document. So by the time Walter died, Daniel already owned the company outright. Correct, Caroline said. The inheritance was not the beginning of his ownership. That distinction mattered more than Richard realized. Walter had not simply handed me a fortune at the end of his life. Years earlier, I had placed my own savings into a farm most investors would have considered too complicated. I had accepted risk when there was no development proposal and no guarantee the land would ever produce anything beyond agricultural income. Walter and I spent years building a structure that allowed him to remain on the property while protecting my investment. The final amendment came much later. Why did he transfer the last 35%? Ethan asked. I looked toward Walter's old farmhouse. Because his health was declining, and he wanted everything settled while he could still make the decisions himself. Caroline turned another page. There is also language about future proceeds. Yes. Richard immediately focused on that. What happens to the $6.4 million if you sell the 41 acres? It does not simply become spending money. The agreement required part of any development proceeds to strengthen the agricultural operation. Debt reserves, land improvements, conservation work, equipment replacement, and long-term maintenance all came before personal distributions. Walter had insisted on that structure. I had agreed. How much would actually come to you? Richard asked. Eventually? That depends on taxes, transaction costs, reinvestment, and what the trust requires. But potentially millions. Potentially. Richard shook his head slowly. And you are still driving an 11-year-old pickup. It starts every morning. That is not the point. It is when I need a truck. Caroline laughed, and even Richard smiled. Then Ethan picked up the handwritten page I had brought from Walter's desk. Is this his writing? Yes. He read the 3 sentences quietly. Keep the good ground working. Do not let quick money make permanent decisions. Leave the place stronger than you found it. Richard leaned over to read them. His expression changed. That is why you reduced the development area. That was part of it. You were not negotiating for the highest price. I was negotiating for the best outcome. Caroline looked toward the fields. Those are very different things. Usually. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property. For the first time, Richard did not complain about the gravel, his shoes, or the distance. I showed them the 41 acres Bennett wanted to purchase. Most of that ground had poorer soil than the central fields and already bordered the county road. Then I showed them the 27 acres I had removed from the original proposal. A drainage channel crossed part of it before feeding lower farmland used by Sam and another tenant farmer. If they built through here, Ethan said, the impact would not stay here. Exactly. Richard stood at the edge of the field, looking toward the ridge. I did not understand any of this when I saw the map. Neither did Bennett at first. And you did because you work the land. Because Walter taught me to pay my old pickup. Nobody suggested replacing the kitchen cabinets. Richard asked about the orchard contract with the restaurants. Caroline wanted to know how the conservation payments worked. Ethan asked whether I ever needed help reviewing business plans. The questions were different now because they were finally about what I had actually built. 2 weeks later, Bennett accepted nearly all of my conditions. The attorney still needed to finalize the agreement, and county approvals could take months, but the important boundaries were protected. I called Richard after the revised documents arrived. They accepted the 41 acres. At 6.4. Yes, plus the infrastructure commitments. He was quiet for a moment. Congratulations. Thank you. I mean it. I know. Then he surprised me. Do not buy a new truck just because I made fun of yours. I was not planning to. Good. Now I would feel responsible. I laughed. After we hung up, I drove across the property to Walter's farmhouse. The evening light stretched across the fields, and harvest had begun on the western acreage. Sam's combine moved slowly in the distance. I sat on Walter's porch with his handwritten note in my pocket. $6.4 million was a number my family would once have used to measure whether my choices had been successful. Sitting there, I understood why it no longer felt like the most important number. 34 acres had been enough to give me the life I wanted. 620 neighboring acres had given me something different, responsibility. Walter had trusted me because I had never looked over his fence and imagined what I could take from him. I had looked over it and asked what needed to be done. And somewhere between repairing that first fence post and signing the trust documents years later, the small farm my family laughed at had become the center of something none of us had understood from the road. The agreement with Bennett Development took another 4 months to complete, which was exactly why I never celebrated numbers written on preliminary offers. Surveys had to be approved, zoning language revised, drainage plans reviewed, and every conservation boundary confirmed before I signed anything. By February, the 41-acre transaction was finally scheduled to close. Richard surprised me by never asking whether the money had arrived. Instead, he called one evening to ask whether Sam had finished harvesting before the snow came. Barely, I said. 3 days before the first real storm. Good. I was wondering about that lower field. 6 months earlier, my brother could not have identified the lower field if I had handed him a map. Caroline changed too. She started bringing some of her real estate clients farther outside Columbus and called me occasionally when a property involved agricultural restrictions. She never pretended I was an attorney or an expert in every land issue. She simply understood that I had experience she had once overlooked. Ethan changed the most visibly. He began spending one Saturday each month at the farm, helping me review operating plans and learning how the leases worked. I paid him whenever he did real work. The first time I handed him a check, he tried to refuse it. Family can still invoice family, I told him. That sounds like something Grandpa would have hated. Walter would have approved. I meant my grandfather. Then you are probably right. The Bennett closing happened on a cold Tuesday morning at an attorney's office in town. The final purchase price remained $6.4 million. After transaction costs, taxes, required reserves, and the allocation specified by the trust structure, a substantial amount remained available for reinvestment. I did not buy a new house. I did not move. I did not replace the pickup. Instead, we rebuilt drainage on 200 acres, replaced an equipment shed that had been deteriorating for years, established a long-term soil improvement program, and placed additional acreage under conservation protection. I also created a reserve that would allow the farm to survive several poor seasons without borrowing against the land. When I showed Richard the plan, he studied it for several minutes. You really are putting most of it back into the property. That was always the plan. You could retire. From what? Working. I like working. He shook his head. I am beginning to think you moved out here specifically to become impossible to understand. That was only a secondary benefit. By spring, construction began on the county road parcel. From my farmhouse, I could barely see it beyond the rise. More importantly, farm traffic remained separated from the project, the drainage system stayed protected, and the best agricultural ground continued producing exactly as Walter intended. One Saturday in May, my family came for lunch. It was the first gathering at the farm since the weekend when everything changed. Richard arrived in his black SUV, but this time he parked beside the barn without worrying about dust. Caroline brought dessert. Melissa brought a salad. Ethan arrived early enough to help me move tables onto the porch. While we ate, Richard looked toward my original fields. How many acres did you say you started with? 34. And you bought them because? Because I could afford them. I liked the farmhouse, and I wanted enough land to see whether I could build something. Caroline smiled. Apparently you could. I looked at the orchard, the barn, and the fence line where Walter had first introduced himself because one of my posts leaned onto his property. I had help. After lunch, Richard and I walked toward that same fence. The original post was long gone, but I remembered exactly where it had stood. I owe you another apology, he said. You already apologized. Not for this. He looked across the property. When I saw your farm, I thought small meant unsuccessful. I never considered that you might have chosen the size because it was where you wanted to begin. I did. And then when I learned about Walter's land, I made the opposite mistake. Suddenly I thought bigger meant better. I smiled. You have had an educational year. Expensive education, and I did not even get the $6.4 million. We both laughed. Then his expression became serious. I am proud of you. Those words would have meant more to me 8 years earlier. I was glad they did not mean less now. Thank you. We stood there for a while without talking. Beyond the fence, Sam was preparing one field for planting. Farther north, cattle moved slowly across the pasture. Walter's farmhouse remained where it had always been, shaded by 2 old maple trees. Nothing about the view advertised wealth. There were no gates with my name on them, no signs announcing the value of the land, and no reason for anyone driving past to know that a developer had recently paid millions for 41 acres nearby. That suited me. Later that afternoon, Ethan found Walter's handwritten note framed on the wall inside my workshop. You framed it? Caroline did. He read the final line again. Leave the place stronger than you found it. Do you think you have? He asked. I looked through the open workshop door toward the fields. Not yet. He seemed surprised. After everything you have done. That sentence does not have a finish line. Walter understood something my family and I had taken years to learn. Success was not the size of the farm, the value on a deed, the number in a bank account, or whether other people were impressed by what they saw from the road. The 34 acres everyone mocked had given me a place to begin. The neighboring 620 acres had given me a responsibility I never expected. And the money everyone assumed would change my life ended up proving why I had chosen this life in the first place. I had not left the city because I wanted less. I had left because I finally understood what I wanted more of: useful work, enough time to notice where I was standing, and something worth leaving stronger than I found it.